If you've been sitting with this question, why do I feel bad after breaking up with someone, maybe someone you even chose to leave, then this video was made for you. Not because you need someone to tell you what to do, but because what is happening inside you right now has a name, a shape, and a real scientific explanation, and knowing that can make it slightly less terrifying. The pain doesn't care about the length of the relationship. It doesn't care about whether the breakup was mutual or a long time coming or something that blindsided you completely. And it doesn't care about what anyone else thinks your recovery should look like or how long it should take. What you are experiencing is real. It is not weakness, and it is not an exaggeration. It is the predictable, measurable output of a nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do when a significant attachment is disrupted. We're going to look together at what that actually means. Before anything else, let's clear some space around this. The intensity of what you're feeling after a breakup is not a measurement of how deeply you were supposed to love this person, or how wise you were about the relationship, or how strong you are as a person. Those stories sometimes attach themselves to this kind of pain, and none of them are accurate. What you are experiencing is the consequence of a real biological process that operates almost entirely outside of conscious control. Neuroscientists, attachment researchers, and clinical psychologists have been studying this specific kind of pain for decades, and what they have found consistently is that the brain's response to significant relationship loss is not an emotional indulgence. It is a physiological event. It follows patterns, it has documented causes, and it responds over time to things you can actually do. That is what we are going to explore. When you are in a close romantic relationship, your brain is doing something far more complex than simply feeling love. The neuroscientist Stephanie Cacioppo, whose work on romantic love and social neuroscience at the University of Chicago spans more than 2 decades, describes what she calls a whole brain event, a state in which reward circuits, threat detection systems, memory networks, and bodily regulation mechanisms are all simultaneously organized around another person. 3 neurochemicals get a lot of attention in this conversation, and for good reason. Dopamine is the brain's anticipation and motivation signal. It fires in response to things the brain has learned to expect as rewarding. Serotonin plays a role in mood stability and the general sense of contentment. Oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding neurochemical, is released through physical closeness, sustained eye contact, and even just the familiar sound of someone's voice. What matters most here is the word organized. Over the course of a relationship, your brain literally restructures its daily chemistry around the presence of another person. That restructuring does not reverse overnight. The most detailed evidence for what love looks like inside a living brain comes from the work of Helen Fisher, a biological anthropologist and neuroscientist whose team at Rutgers University spent years placing people newly in love inside functional MRI scanners and watching what activated. When participants looked at photographs of their romantic partners, the brain region that lit up most reliably was the ventral tegmental area, a structure buried deep in the midbrain associated with reward, craving, and motivated pursuit. This is not the area associated with calm, affectionate attachment. This is the area associated with wanting. Fisher's findings, published in the Journal of Neurophysiology, led her to argue that romantic love should be understood not primarily as an emotion, but as a drive, as fundamental and as relentless as hunger. That framing matters because it explains something that can otherwise feel baffling. Love does not respond to logic any more than hunger does. Telling yourself you shouldn't feel this way is about as effective as telling your stomach not to be empty. Here is the part that catches most people off guard. When a relationship ends, the dopamine doesn't simply stop. The circuits that were organized around your partner don't quietly switch off. Instead, research shows that they often become hyperactive, continuing to fire in anticipation of a reward that is no longer arriving. A 2010 study led by Lucy Brown at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, conducted in collaboration with Fisher's team, placed people in brain scanners shortly after they had experienced unwanted romantic rejection. What the scans showed was striking. The same reward regions that activate in people in love were still activating in people in grief, still expecting, still reaching, still searching for what was no longer there. This is why you might find yourself reflexively picking up your phone. Why a particular song comes on and your whole body responds before your mind has processed anything. Why you have a flash of wanting to tell them something funny before you remember. Your brain is not confused about reality. It is running a search it has not yet been told to stop. Fisher's team didn't stop at studying people who were in love. They also placed people in brain scanners shortly after experiencing unwanted breakups, and the results, published in the Journal of Neurophysiology in 2010, described a brain under something far more complex than sadness. The scans showed simultaneous activation of brain regions associated with reward and craving, physical pain, obsessive thinking, and the kind of intense emotional arousal that makes clear decision-making genuinely unreliable. What Fisher noticed was that the overall pattern looked strikingly similar to what addiction neuroscientists observe in people going through substance withdrawal. She used the word deliberately, and she backed it with imaging data. The restlessness, the intrusiveness of the thoughts, the way attention keeps getting pulled back regardless of what you are trying to do. The oscillation between hope and crushing loss within the same hour. These are not signs of weakness or excessive attachment. They are the documented, mapped, measurable signatures of a brain reorganizing itself around the removal of something it had come to depend on neurochemically. That is what you are living through right now. The effects don't stay confined to the brain. When the brain registers a significant social loss, it activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the body's primary stress response system, triggering an elevated release of cortisol, the main stress hormone. Research published in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology has documented significant cortisol elevations in people going through relationship dissolution, elevations comparable in magnitude to other forms of major acute stress. When cortisol remains elevated over days and weeks, it produces a recognizable cluster of effects: fragmented sleep, changes in appetite in either direction, difficulty concentrating, a persistent low-grade physical heaviness, and measurable suppression of immune function. This is why a breakup often feels indistinguishable from being physically ill, because in a very real physiological sense your body is under genuine stress load. The exhaustion is not laziness. The appetite disruption is not drama. The aching in your chest is not a metaphor. These are outputs of a stressed nervous system, and they deserve to be acknowledged and taken care of accordingly. One of the most important findings in modern social neuroscience came from Naomi Eisenberger's lab at UCLA. Eisenberger and her colleagues used brain imaging to investigate what happens when people experience social exclusion and rejection, and what they found challenged a long-held assumption. The brain does not process social pain in a separate region from physical pain. It processes them in the same place. Specifically, social rejection activated the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, two regions that are centrally involved in the felt unpleasantness of physical injury. In subsequent studies, Eisenberger's team found that the degree of social pain people reported from a breakup correlated with the intensity of activation in exactly these physical pain regions. In a separate line of research, participants who took over-the-counter pain relief reported measurably reduced feelings of social pain, which speaks to how genuine the neural overlap actually is. When you say that a breakup hurts, you are not using a figure of speech. Your brain is processing it with the same circuitry it uses for a physical wound, and that is not something you can simply decide to rise above. There is another dimension of breakup pain that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and it explains why the loss often feels larger than simply losing a person. Relationships don't only connect us to someone else. Over time, they become embedded in our own sense of who we are. The psychologist Erica Slaughter and her colleagues at Northwestern University published a landmark 2010 paper in the journal Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin demonstrating, through both open-ended self-concept measures and quantitative analysis, that after a breakup, participant self-concepts became measurably smaller and less clearly defined. The psychologists Arthur and Elaine Aron had earlier developed what they called the self-expansion model of love, which proposes that in intimate relationships, we genuinely incorporate aspects of our partners into our own identities, their interests, their perspectives, their presence in our daily routines, their role in our imagined futures. When the relationship ends, you don't only lose the other person. You lose the self that only existed inside that specific context. The grief is not just for them. It is also for a version of you that no longer has a home. Beyond the self you were in the relationship, there is something else you may be grieving. A future that never actually happened, but that felt completely real. At some point in the relationship, whether or not you were conscious of it, you began building imagined versions of your life that included this person. Decisions you assumed you would make together. Places you assumed you would go. A particular feeling of what being a we meant and where it was headed. Research on what psychologists call possible selves, developed in part through work by Hazel Marcus at Stanford University, has shown that we don't only live in the present. We live simultaneously in a rich internal world of who we might become, and intimate partners become central characters in those imagined futures. The grief researcher and clinical psychologist Mary Frances O'Connor, whose research at the University of Arizona integrates neuroscience with attachment theory, describes the mourning of a relationship as partially the mourning of a possible self that will now not exist. That grief is completely legitimate. It was real to you, even if it never took place in the world. Grief rarely arrives in neat, predictable stages, and one of the quietly harmful ideas that can add suffering on top of the grief itself is the belief that there is a correct sequence to move through, and that deviating from it means something is wrong with you. The psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross introduced her 5-stage model in 1969, based primarily on her clinical work with terminally ill patients, and while it brought enormous compassion into public conversations about loss, grief researchers have since been careful to distinguish its context from the wide variety of ways people actually experience relationship loss. A 2007 study in the Journal of Loss and Trauma by Camille Wertman and Roxanne Cohen-Silver found that people's trajectories through grief varied substantially. Some cycled repeatedly through the same emotional states. Some moved through with a resilience that didn't pass through discrete stages at all, and very few followed anything resembling a clean linear sequence. The point is not that your grief is abnormal. The point is that there is no single map for this territory, and trying to force your experience onto someone else's map only creates a second layer of pain. There is actually a quiet, beautiful game built around this exact idea. A 3D sanctuary called Inner Phoenix, but more on that in a minute. Let's keep going first. When you are in the thick of it, the feelings can seem like weather, massive, formless, and without explanation. But each feeling, even the most overwhelming ones, is carrying specific information if you're willing to approach it with curiosity rather than urgency to make it stop. The psychologist and neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, whose theory of constructed emotion has been developed through research at Northwestern University, argues that emotions are not spontaneous eruptions from a fixed, hardwired system. They are the brain's best interpretive attempt to make sense of incoming bodily states and environmental signals. They are predictions, not reactions. And as predictions, they can be read. The particular hollow ache of missing someone is pointing towards something you valued and no longer have access to. The edge of anger that keeps surfacing is often a signal that something you needed was not being honored, perhaps for a long time before the ending. The flat, heavy sadness is a signal too, one worth approaching with openness rather than treating as a problem to be solved as quickly as possible. Every feeling points toward a need, and the clearest, most enduring research on human needs in the context of loss comes from the foundational work of Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary, whose 1995 paper in Psychological Bulletin systematically reviewed hundreds of studies across multiple disciplines to build what they called the need to belong hypothesis. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Human beings have a biologically grounded, fundamental need for stable and meaningful social connection, and that threats to belonging trigger powerful, measurable psychological and physiological consequences. This is not a soft or speculative idea. Baumeister and Leary reviewed evidence from developmental psychology, social psychology, neuroscience, and medicine, and found convergent support across all of them. When a relationship ends, several fundamental needs can be disrupted at once. The need to belong, the need to be understood, the need for safety and predictability in your daily life, the need to feel that you matter to someone. Understanding which of those needs is most pressing for you right now doesn't eliminate the pain immediately, but it transforms it from something formless and overwhelming into something you can actually begin to orient toward and respond to. One of the most rigorously studied and least complicated tools for processing emotional pain is writing. James Pennebaker, a psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin, spent decades designing and running studies on what happens when people write honestly about emotionally difficult experiences. His research, published across dozens of peer-reviewed papers, demonstrated that expressive writing sessions as short as 15 to 20 minutes, practiced over 3 to 4 consecutive days, produced measurable effects, improved immune markers, reduced intrusive thinking, greater emotional integration over time, and better psychological adjustment compared to control groups who wrote about neutral topics. The proposed mechanism involves something specific about language. Putting a chaotic experience into words engages the prefrontal cortex in ways that raw, emotional flooding does not, which gradually helps the brain build a coherent narrative around something that had been fragmented and unresolved. You do not need to write beautifully. You do not need to have anything figured out before you start. You just need to write honestly, without editing yourself, for a set amount of time, and let the brain do what it was designed to do once it has language to work with. The body holds grief in ways that go beyond the obvious symptoms, and there are research-supported somatic approaches that can help regulate your nervous system in the middle of intense emotional pain, without requiring you to think your way through anything first. The work of psychiatrist and neuroscientist Stephen Porges, whose polyvagal theory was developed over decades of research at institutions, including the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University, placed the vagus nerve at the center of the human experience of safety, connection, and physiological regulation. The vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve in the body, running from the brainstem down through the throat, chest, and abdomen, and it plays a key role in shifting the nervous system between states of high arousal and genuine calm. Research building on Porges' framework has identified specific, low-effort practices that activate what he calls the vagal brake, the mechanism that slows heart rate and signals safety to the system. Extended exhales in which the breath out is deliberately longer than the breath in, cold water on the face, which activates the dive reflex, slow rhythmic humming or singing, and gentle, repetitive rocking. These are not wellness trends. They are physiologically grounded tools with a clear mechanism of action and a growing body of supporting research behind them. There is a particular kind of cruelty that many people direct toward themselves after a breakup, a relentless internal prosecution that reviews every decision, every missed signal, every moment that could have been handled differently. This self-criticism often masquerades as accountability, but the research is clear that it is actually one of the primary obstacles to genuine healing. Kristen Neff, a psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin whose work on self-compassion has appeared in journals including Self and Identity, Clinical Psychology Review, and Mindfulness, defines self-compassion as resting on 3 components: treating yourself with the same kindness you would offer a close friend who is suffering, recognizing that suffering and imperfection are part of the shared human experience rather than evidence of personal failure, and holding difficult feelings in mindful awareness rather than either suppressing them or being overwhelmed by them. Studies from Neff's lab and from researchers building on her framework consistently show that higher self-compassion is associated with lower rumination, faster emotional recovery, greater resilience, and better long-term mental health. The internal prosecutor is not helping you become better. It is simply keeping you in pain longer than you need to be. Cognitive behavioral therapy offers some of the most extensively tested psychological tools available for navigating grief and emotional pain, and one of the most studied is cognitive reappraisal, the deliberate practice of examining the meaning you have assigned to an experience and asking whether that meaning is accurate and whether other interpretations are possible. The psychologist James Gross, whose emotion regulation research at Stanford University's Psychophysiology Laboratory has been influential for decades, found through both self-report studies and neuroimaging research that cognitive reappraisal produced genuine changes in emotional experience and measurable shifts in prefrontal cortex activity, the brain region associated with regulating the amygdala, which is the brain's primary alarm system. This doesn't mean forcing positivity or deciding the breakup was secretly beneficial. It means investigating the story your pain is telling you. It means asking, what does this loss mean to me about who I am and what my future holds? And then asking honestly, is that interpretation the only accurate one available, or is it the most frightened version of events rather than the most true? Human beings were not built to process major loss alone. This is not a philosophical observation. It is a point grounded in primate biology and in decades of social support research. A 2014 meta-analysis published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, synthesizing data across dozens of studies and thousands of participants, found that perceived social support was among the strongest predictors of well-being and recovery speed after major life stressors, including relationship dissolution. One mechanism for this is oxytocin. The bonding neurochemical that was once organized primarily around your partner can be stimulated by other forms of warm human contact. Ruth Feldman at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel has published extensively on synchronous human interaction, the phenomenon of being with another person who is paying full, responsive attention to you, and its measurable effects on oxytocin levels and felt safety. You do not have to talk about the breakup for this to work. You just have to be near someone who genuinely sees you and let your nervous system register at a level below language that you are not alone in this. It would be incomplete and in some ways dishonest to talk about the pain of a breakup without also introducing what researchers have consistently found in its aftermath. Not as a silver lining and not as a reason to rush through the grief, but because the science is real and it belongs in this conversation. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, psychologists at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, began developing the concept of post-traumatic growth in the 1990s, and their subsequent research, including the development of the post-traumatic growth inventory used in studies worldwide, documented something that surprised many people in the field. A significant number of people who experienced painful life events, including major relationship losses, reported meaningful development in their aftermath. Not simply a return to baseline, actual growth, a stronger sense of personal strength, a greater openness to new possibilities, deeper or more genuine relationships, a fuller appreciation of being alive, and sometimes a shift in core priorities that would not have occurred any other way. Tedeschi and Calhoun were careful to note that growth and suffering are not opposites. They coexist, and that is not a contradiction to resolve. It is simply what recovery within a full life can look like. Healing from a breakup does not look like forgetting. It doesn't look like arriving at a point of complete indifference toward the person or toward what the relationship meant. And it almost certainly does not look like a clean upward curve from pain to peace. What recovery actually looks like, in the language of researchers who study emotional adjustment, is a gradual shift in proportion. The moments of acute pain become shorter, less frequent, and less consuming. The moments of ordinary life and of unexpected pleasure begin to occupy more of the available space. Mary Frances O'Connor, a neuroscientist at the University of Arizona whose research integrates brain imaging with attachment science, describes how the grieving brain slowly builds new prediction models for daily life. New routines, new associations, new sources of reward. The old neural pathways don't simply vanish, they gradually weaken from disuse, not because you have willed them away, but because attention and lived experience are both constantly reshaping the brain. This takes time that cannot be safely shortened. What it requires from you is not heroism or the suspension of pain. It is simply a willingness to keep showing up to your own life, even on the days when that feels like the only thing you can manage. Here is something worth holding onto during the harder moments. Your brain is not fixed. The patterns that feel permanent right now, the automatic reaches, the phantom awareness of someone's absence, the associations that keep pulling your attention back regardless of what you are trying to focus on, are not hardwired into you forever. They are learned, and what is learned can change. The psychologist Donald Hebb articulated the principle now summarized as neurons that fire together wire together, meaning the brain builds its pathways through repeated activation. The inverse is equally true. Pathways that stop receiving activation gradually lose their strength. Decades of neuroplasticity research, including foundational work by Michael Merzenich at the University of California, San Francisco, have demonstrated consistently that adult brains continue to reorganize themselves in response to new experience, new attention, and new behavior. This means that every moment you invest in something real and present, a conversation that absorbs you, a walk, a piece of music, a task that requires your full attention, is not avoidance or escapism. It is literally the biological mechanism through which change happens. You are doing the work even when it doesn't feel like anything significant is occurring. There's a particular layer of suffering that gets added on top of grief when someone begins to feel that they are taking too long to recover, that they should be further along by now, that something must be wrong with them for still feeling this. That additional suffering is not caused by the grief itself. It is caused by a comparison to an imaginary timeline that has no scientific basis. A 2019 study in clinical psychological science, conducted by researchers at the University of Arizona, including psychologist David Sabara, who has devoted years of research to psychological adjustment following relationship dissolution, found substantial individual variation in recovery trajectories and cautioned explicitly against prescriptive timelines that fail to account for the specific history and nature of the relationship, the individual's attachment patterns, the circumstances of the ending, and a wide range of other personal variables. The correct timeline for your recovery is not someone else's idea of when you should be over it. It is the one your own nervous system, your emotional history, and your specific circumstances produce. And that timeline deserves to be treated with respect. So here is where this lands. The pain you are sitting with after a breakup is real. It has a neurological basis. It is not a measure of your worth, your judgment, or your emotional strength. And it will, in a timeline that belongs entirely to you, shift. Not because you find the perfect thing to say to yourself, and not because you force it to resolve on someone else's schedule, but because you are a human being with a brain that was built for exactly this, to attach, to lose, to grieve, and to slowly reorganize itself towards something new through the accumulation of lived experience. You do not have to have it together to start. You just have to stay. And hey, before you go, there's a 3D game called Inner Phoenix. You walk through it like a quiet temple, with rooms for what you are observing, what you are feeling, what you need, and what you might try next. It was made for exactly these moments. No pressure. Scan the QR code, or check the link on description whenever you are ready.